Story. Chapter 1. The Prison of Stone and Iron. The air was damp, heavy with the stench of mold and rust. Deep beneath the earth, where no sunlight ever reached, stretched the labyrinth of cells that the Empire called its justice. Yet everyone knew that justice never touched this place. What lived here was punishment, cruelty, and the slow erosion of the human soul. Adrian, a man of 30 winters, stood against the stone wall, shackled by iron bands biting into his wrists. His once proud face was hollowed now, cheekbones sharp, his black hair hanging in unkempt strands across eyes that had lost their warmth. Once he had been a soldier, one of the Emperor's elite guards, but loyalty had failed him when politics turned, and his refusal to betray comrades branded him a traitor. The guards who dragged him down here wore leather armor and sneers of disdain. They called him the Crow, for his dark hair and the omen of doom that seemed to follow him. To Adrian, their words were just echoes. His true torment was the silence of the cell, broken only by the clank of chains and the cries of others. In nearby chambers, at night he heard them, screams torn from the throats of men and women broken on the rack, or the hollow sobs of those kept alive only to suffer longer. There were whispers too, half-mad voices of prisoners who had endured too long in the dark. The dungeon was alive, breathing despair into every stone dot. On the third night, they came for him. 2 guards unchained him roughly and dragged him through. Corridors lit only by torchlight, the flames flickering against damp walls. The chamber they led him to was wider, its ceiling high and lost in shadow. Chains dangled from hooks, and in the center stood the table, the rack, its wooden frame stained dark from countless sessions of agony. Adrian's heart did not race. He had known this was coming. What unsettled him was the figure that emerged. From the shadows, a man draped in crimson robes, his face pale and expressionless, eyes cold like polished marble. This was Master Varos, the warden and torturer of the Emperor. He did not shout, did not curse. His cruelty lay in calm precision. "You held your tongue," Varos said softly, circling Adrian like a vulture. "You refuse to confess, though. We both know your comrades are dust by now. Still, the Emperor desires names, and I am here to carve them out of you." The guards forced Adrian onto the rack, strapping his ankles and wrists into place. The leather was damp with sweat of previous victims. As the wheel turned, his body stretched taut, tendons screaming, bones threatening to snap. Pain seared through him, but he clenched his jaw, refusing to give the satisfaction of a scream. Varos leaned close, whispering, "Pain is a river. It always finds the cracks, and every man breaks in time." The torture did not end quickly. Hours blurred as Varos alternated between pulling the rack tighter and releasing it just enough for Adrian's joints to grind back into place, a cycle of torment designed not to kill, but to hollow him out. By the end, Adrian's body was drenched in sweat, trembling uncontrollably, his vision swimming in red dot. When they finally unstrapped him, he collapsed to the floor like a rag doll. The guards laughed, one of them kicking his ribs for amusement, before dragging him back to his cell. His breath rattled in his chest, every movement agony. But still he had spoken no names. In the darkness of his cell, Adrian whispered to himself. Not prayers, for the gods had long abandoned this place, but promises. Promises that if he survived, he would see the Empire's cruelty burn. Promises that his suffering would not be meaningless. The dungeon moaned around him, filled with echoes of others who had made the same vows, some long dead, others broken beyond repair. Whether Adrian would share their fate or forge his own path remained to be seen. But in that moment, as he lay broken on the stone floor, his eyes hardened. Somewhere deep beneath the agony, a fire still burned. Story. Chapter 2. The games of pain time in the dungeon dissolved into something shapeless. There were no days or nights, only the endless darkness punctuated by screams. Adrian's body had not yet healed from the rack. His shoulders throbbed, joints swollen, ribs aching, where the guard's boot had struck. Yet still they came for him. This time, he was led not to the rack but to a different chamber, one that reeked of iron and smoke. The air was hotter here, the walls blackened from the soot of torches. Strange instruments lay arranged on a table. Pincers, brands, knives with curved edges meant not for killing, but for peeling life away slowly. Master Varos awaited him again, seated in a high-backed chair as though presiding over some macabre court. His crimson robe shimmered in the torchlight, and in his hand he held a scroll. "The Emperor demands results," he said calmly. "You will speak, or your body will teach others the price of silence." The guards forced Adrian to his knees. His chains rattled as they pinned his arms behind his back. Varos gestured, and one of the guards brought forward a brazier glowing with coals. Iron rods lay within, heating until their tips were white. The first brand pressed against Adrian's chest. The hiss of flesh searing filled the room, and a smell like roasted meat rose into the air. Adrian bit down on his tongue until blood filled his mouth, refusing to cry out. Varos's lips curled in something like amusement. The torture was methodical. Heated irons marked his skin, each burn a deliberate pattern etched into his body. Then came the pincers, tearing strips of flesh from his arms. Adrian's world became a storm of agony, his body twitching against the chains as sweat poured down his face. His once proud frame was reduced to trembling flesh, yet still he did not yield. At last, Varos ordered the guards to stop. "Interesting," he murmured, studying Adrian's ravaged body as though it were an experiment. "You endure more than most. That makes you valuable. Pain teaches, and you may yet teach others." Adrian was dragged back to his cell, half-conscious, his chest a lattice of burns, blood trailing behind him. He collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. His vision swam with shadows, yet inside, something hardened further. Every moment of torture, every strike and burn, became fuel for the fire of vengeance smoldering in his chest. He began to listen more closely to the other prisoners. Through the stone walls came fragments of words, whispered names, pleas, fragments of stories. There were many here, rebels, soldiers, innocents accused falsely. Their voices blended into a chorus of despair. Yet in that chorus, Adrian heard kinship. The dungeon was not just a place of torment, it was also a crucible. Those who survived it too long became something else, not merely victims but embers waiting for a chance to ignite. Adrian closed his eyes, the burns on his chest throbbing with every breath, and whispered the vow again. "If I live, I will bring this empire to its knees." Story. Chapter 3. The cage of silence. Adrian awoke to the rattle of chains. He had no sense of how long it had been since the brands and pincers had carved their marks into him. Time in the dungeon dissolved into a haze of agony. His wounds oozed, his body fevered, yet still, when the guards came, he dragged himself to his feet. This time, they led him not to the rack nor the brazier chamber, but to a smaller room. It was circular, with stone walls slick with condensation. In its center stood a cage, iron, bars curved into a sphere large enough to hold a man crouched but not standing. Master Varos stood beside it, hands folded in his crimson robes. His expression was calm as always, his voice a quiet blade. "Your silence persists," he said. "Then you shall have silence returned to you. You will learn how noise becomes madness." The guards forced Adrian inside. The iron bars scraped his skin as they locked the sphere shut. He could not stretch his legs, could not straighten his back. His body curled like an animal, and every attempt to move only pressed metal deeper into his wounds. For hours he remained there. His breath echoed within the iron sphere, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then came the sounds. Drums, chains dragged across stone, screams recorded somehow, echoed through hidden vents in the walls. Varos had filled the chamber with noise designed to burrow into the mind. The sound never ceased. Sometimes it was a shriek so high it pierced his skull, sometimes whispers so faint he strained to hear. Hours blurred into days. Adrian's body cramped, his burns inflamed, his flesh torn where iron pressed. His mind began to unravel. He heard voices, his comrades long dead calling his name. He saw shadows moving through the bars though the room was empty. But through the torment, he clung to a single anchor, His vow. He repeated it silently with each wave of sound. I will not break. I will endure. When Varos returned, he found Adrian, gaunt, trembling, but still alive. His lips cracked, his eyes hollow yet still smoldering. You are different, Varos murmured, almost curious. Perhaps the Emperor was right to keep you alive. Pain alone may not break you, but silence, madness, that may yet carve you hollow. Adrian said nothing. His voice was gone, his throat raw from screams he could not remember making. But his silence now was his defiance. Even broken, even fevered, he would not surrender the names Varos sought. The guards hauled him back to his cell, dropping him like a corpse. He curled on the floor, his body racked with spasms. Yet in his fevered mind, an ember glowed. For the first time, he realized Varos feared him, not openly, but beneath that cold mask. The torturer had seen countless prisoners, and yet Adrian still lived, still resisted. That alone made him dangerous. Story. Chapter 4. The Trial of Needles. The days blurred into a fog of pain and silence. Adrian no longer knew how many times he had been dragged from his cell. His body was a map of wounds, burns seared into his chest, torn flesh along his arms, bruises blossoming across his ribs. And yet he endured. The guards came again, their laughter echoing down the stone corridor. He rose shakily to meet them, refusing to crawl, even though every step tore fire through his muscles. They chained his wrists and dragged him into another chamber. This room was colder than the others. Iron tables gleamed in the torchlight, and upon them lay rows of instruments, needles of varying length and thickness, some as fine as hair, others long enough to pierce bone. Master Varos stood at the far end, his crimson robes immaculate despite the filth of the dungeon. His pale face was calm, but there was something sharper in his gaze today, like a predator circling prey. Endurance has become your shield, he said softly. So we shall test its edges. The body, after all, is a vessel. What happens when it is filled with pain until it overflows? The guards forced Adrian onto the table, strapping him down. His body trembled as the cold iron pressed against his back. He stared at the ceiling, refusing to meet Varos's gaze. The first needle slid beneath his fingernail. The pain was instant, sharp, burning deeper than any brand. Adrian's teeth clenched so hard his jaw ached, but he did not cry out. Then came the second, then the third. Each nail was invaded, his hands transformed into fire. Varos worked slowly, methodically, his pale hands precise as a surgeon. The needles drove into muscle, piercing thighs, shoulders, even the tender flesh of Adrian's feet. His body convulsed against the straps, veins bulging, sweat pouring from him in rivers. Still, he did not break. The chamber echoed only with his ragged breathing and the metallic scrape of instruments. The silence enraged the guards, who shouted insults, but Varos silenced them with a gesture. No, let him suffer in silence. That is his defiance. And I will unmake it. Hours passed. Adrian lost track of how many needles pierced him. His skin was a canvas of small wounds, each one pulsing with agony. Blood trickled in thin lines across his chest and arms. His mind began to blur, each wave of torment dissolving the edges of thought. When at last the needles were withdrawn, Adrian lay trembling, his breath shallow, body twitching from shock. Varos leaned close, his cold eyes studying Adrian like a scholar, gazing at a rare specimen. You are remarkable, he whispered. But remember this, even stone cracks under endless drops of water. I have eternity. You do not. Dragged back to his cell once more, Adrian collapsed against the wall, his body aflame with wounds. His hands shook violently, fingers twisted and swollen. Yet still his vow remained. If anything, the agony sharpened it. His suffering was no longer just his own. It was the weight of every prisoner's scream, every nameless soul broken in these halls. In the silence of the dungeon, Adrian whispered hoarsely, his voice barely audible. You will not have me. And one day, I will have you. Chapter 5. The Wheel of Agony. The dungeon doors groaned open, and Aurelia was yanked forward by 2 armored guards. She had already lost much of her strength, her steps faltering as her bare feet scraped across the damp stone. The governor had promised a new lesson for the defiant prisoner. This time, it would be one of the most dreaded devices in his arsenal, the breaking wheel. The wheel loomed in the center of the chamber, a massive wooden frame studded with iron, elevated on supports. Prisoners whispered its name in terror, for it promised not only pain, but humiliation, a slow unraveling of the body until nothing remained but twisted flesh and bone. Aurelia was stripped of her tattered tunic and bound spread-eagle to the spokes, her pale skin already marred with bruises and lash marks from earlier torments. Her long black hair hung down, veiling part of her face, but her eyes still burned with that cold fire that unsettled even her captors. The governor arrived, flanked by nobles eager for spectacle. His voice echoed against the stone walls. Behold, the traitor who defied the empire. Let her body teach obedience. A guard lifted a heavy iron mallet. With ritual slowness, he swung it down upon her shin. A sharp crack split the air, the sound of bone shattering. Aurelia's scream tore through the hall, a raw cry that carried both agony and defiance. Blood welled, dripping onto the wheels. Rim. The mallet fell again, this time upon her forearm. Her body convulsed, the pain so searing that black spots swam in her vision. The crowd leaned forward, murmuring in satisfaction at the gruesome display. Some nobles clapped as though at a feast. But Aurelia did not beg. Each strike wrung screams from her throat, but no plea for mercy left her lips. Inside, her hatred crystallized. With every bone snapped, with every nerve set aflame, she swore vengeance. She imagined their faces burning, their palaces collapsing. This silent vow became her anchor, keeping her mind from shattering. Hours passed. By the time the guards paused, her limbs hung at impossible angles, broken in multiple places. The wheel was rotated, displaying her battered body like a grotesque sculpture. The governor smiled cruelly, raising his goblet. Let her endure. Let the people hear of this. Rebellion ends in ruin. At last, she was unbound, her broken form dumped onto the dungeon floor like refuse. Bloodied and trembling, she forced, her eyes open. Though every breath was torment, her spirit whispered a single truth. They may break my body, but not my will. In the silence of the dungeon, as rats scurried near and torchlight flickered, Aurelia lay in agony. Yet the darkness within her had begun to grow. The empire thought they had crushed her. In truth, they had forged something far more dangerous, a soul that had nothing left to lose. Chapter 6. The Iron Crown. The fifth torment had left Aurelia's body shattered, bones cracked, flesh torn, her breath shallow, yet her spirit still smoldered. The governor, enraged that pain alone had not broken her will, devised a punishment not only of agony, but also of humiliation. The Iron Crown. The nobles gathered once again in the chamber. A brazier of glowing coals illuminated the center, where a black iron circlet rested. Its inner band was lined with jagged spikes, forged to pierce scalp and bone. As the crown heated, it began to glow a deep orange, tiny sparks dancing from the metal. The guards dragged Aurelia forward, her feet scraping on the stone. She could not stand. They had to haul her by the arms. Her long black hair, matted with sweat and blood, clung to her face. Bruises spread across her pale skin like dark blossoms, and her limbs hung weakly, misshapen from the wheel. Yet when her head lifted, the fire in her eyes unsettled the room. She had not yielded. Let her bear the crown of rebellion, the governor sneered, lifting his goblet in mockery. The guards pressed her to her knees. She trembled, but her jaw clenched. The crown was lifted from the coals, its spikes gleaming with heat, smoke rising from its surface. The stench of burning iron filled the hall. Slowly, deliberately, the torturer lowered it onto her head. The moment the metal touched her scalp, a sickening hiss echoed, flesh sizzling under the heat. Aurelia's scream erupted, piercing and raw, reverberating off the stone walls. Blood trickled down her temples, mingling with smoke as the spikes drove inward. The nobles laughed, some covering their noses from the stench of burnt hair and skin. The governor leaned forward, savoring the sight. Guards pressed the crown tighter, each movement embedding the spikes deeper into her skull. Aurelia swayed, nearly unconscious. Yet somewhere within the inferno of pain, her hatred grew sharper. She envisioned the crown, not as her shame, but as her coronation. A vow forged. In fire, every scream became a declaration. You will never break me. At last, the crown cooled upon her head, its weight pressing her down. Blood ran freely, soaking her hair, dripping onto her torn tunic. She collapsed, chest heaving, her body broken, but her gaze still defiant. The governor spat in contempt. Let her rot in darkness with her false crown. She is nothing. But in that darkness, as guards dragged her limp form back to the dungeon, Aurelia's spirit whispered differently. The crown had not unmade her. It had marked her. She was no longer merely a captive. She was becoming something the Empire could never control. Chapter 6. The fracture in his will. The dungeon no longer felt like a mere prison of stone and iron. It had become a living entity, a suffocating presence that wrapped itself around Adrian's body and mind, gnawing at what little remained of his strength. Each day blurred into the next, marked only by the clinking of chains and the distant shuffle of boots along damp corridors. Time lost its shape. Night and day dissolved into an endless, suffocating twilight. The tortures he endured had left his body ravaged. Burn marks scarred his chest. Lash wounds crossed his back like a grotesque script, and his arms and legs were bruised purple from shackles biting into flesh. But it was not the agony of the body that terrified Adrian most. It was the slow corrosion of his mind. In the silence of his cell, voices began to whisper. Sometimes the soft, tender murmur of his mother, begging him to surrender. Sometimes the stern command of his father, urging him to resist. Both voices battled within him, leaving him trembling in madness. On one such night, the iron door shrieked open. Guards entered without a word, dragging him across the corridor to a chamber he had never seen before. Unlike the grim torture rooms with their hooks and chains, this one was lit with candles. Religious icons hung on the walls, cold, watchful eyes of saints painted in fading pigments. At the center stood a priest, his face carved in solemn lines, eyes burning with a zeal that was far more dangerous than hatred. You believe you can endure forever? The priest's voice thundered, heavy with conviction. The flesh will rot, the soul will shatter. Only submission brings release. Adrian raised his head, bloodshot eyes narrowing. For a moment the priest's words pierced him. A flicker of weakness stirred inside his chest. He remembered the world beyond these walls. Sunlit mornings, the scent of wheat fields, the laughter of those he once held close. The thought twisted, like a knife. If I surrender, would it all end? Would the pain finally stop? The priest stepped closer, resting a cold hand on Adrian's shoulder. You need not suffer more. You are just a man, fragile and fleeting. Let go, and you will find peace. For a breath, Adrian almost believed him. His knees wavered, his chest heaved. But then something fierce, buried deep within, flared like embers in ash. He remembered why he was here. The oath he had sworn never to betray, the cause for which he had already lost so much. His pain coiled, with rage, and his lips curled into a broken horse laugh. I would rather be ground into dust, Adrian rasped, than live as your obedient dog. The words struck like a blade in silence. The priest's expression flickered, shock, then a shadow of anger, before settling back into composure. He raised a hand, and torches along the chamber walls flared, painting the room in violent orange light. The guards tightened their grip on Adrian's chains and dragged him toward a wooden frame bristling with iron restraints. That night, the torment resumed, fiercer than before. The heat of the flames licked the chamber, chains rattled with every spasm of his body, yet Adrian clung to his defiance. His laughter turned to gasps, his gasps to silence, until nothing remained but the sound of his heart pounding against the silence of stone. Hours later, He was thrown back into his cell, a broken heap of flesh. His body throbbed with wounds too, raw to move, yet his mind pulsed with a dangerous clarity. The priest had failed to bend him. The guards had failed to silence him. Something inside whispered that if he could endure this night, perhaps he could endure all the nights that followed. But, as Adrian lay against the cold wall staring into the shadows, he realized the true war had only begun. The dungeon would not simply kill him, it would hollow him out, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a husk. He clenched his fists, nails cutting into skin, and swore to himself that if he were to fall, he would fall unbroken. The fracture in his will had appeared, but through it, a new resolve had been born. Chapter 7. The cage of thorns. Adrian awoke to the sound of rattling chains and the acrid smell of rust. His wounds from the iron crown still oozed blood, crusting against his long black hair. His scalp burned with every movement, but he was given no time to rest. Guards dragged him from the darkness of his cell into another chamber, where a new device awaited him. At the center of the chamber stood a horrifying construction, a tall iron cage shaped like a man, its bars twisted into cruel curves. From each inner bar sprouted sharp metal thorns, angled inward so that anyone forced inside would be pressed against them with no escape. It was known as the Cage of Thorns. The torturer priests circled it reverently, as though it were a holy relic. Their leader approached Adrian and said coldly, "You survived the crown. Let us see if you survive the embrace of thorns." Adrian was stripped of his tattered garments and pushed forward. His bare skin, already scarred and broken, shivered in the cold air. The priests forced him into the cage, his back scraping against jagged spikes as he resisted. But the iron door slammed shut, locking him inside. The cage was too narrow for him to stand straight. If he leaned forward, spikes stabbed his chest. If he leaned back, they pierced his spine. His arms and legs trembled as he tried to keep balance, suspended between agonizing choices. Every breath dragged his skin against the thorns, slicing, shallow wounds that began to bleed. Time became a new torture. The priests left him there for hours, chanting outside, letting exhaustion do their work. His body quivered, sweat mixing with blood, muscles twitching from the effort to remain upright. He tried to close his eyes, to escape into memory. But the pain was relentless, dragging him back to reality. As the hours turned into night, the chamber grew silent. Rats crept close, drawn by the scent of blood dripping from the cage. Adrian's lips cracked as he whispered, "I will not break." His body finally gave way. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the thorns. They pierced deep into his back and chest, skewering him like prey on a hunter's trap. His scream echoed, raw and animalistic, but still no words of surrender escaped. When the priests returned, they found him still alive, clinging to consciousness through sheer will. His body was a ruin of puncture wounds, blood soaking the floor. Beneath him, yet in his eyes burned a fire they could not extinguish. One priest muttered with unease, "Even the cage cannot silence him." Their leader, however, smiled cruelly. "Then we shall invent something worse." Adrian, barely breathing, thought to himself, "If this is their victory, let them have it. For every thorn that cuts me, my spirit grows sharper still." Chapter 8. The Eye. Last trial. The dawn that followed was pale and merciless, bleeding through the high-barred window of Adrian's cell. His body was broken, pierced and nearly drained of strength, yet he remained alive. Each shallow breath came ragged, but within his eyes, a flicker of iron will refused to be extinguished. The guards had begun to whisper, some in awe, others in fear, that the man who would not die had become something beyond mortal. But the priests had no intention of allowing his endurance to stand as legend. They sought to crush not just his flesh, but his very soul. For this, they prepared their final trial. That evening, Adrian was dragged through the stone corridors into the largest chamber yet. Unlike the narrow torture rooms of before, this one resembled a grand hall, vaulted ceilings, towering pillars, frescoes of saints glaring down from above. At the center stood an enormous wooden wheel, bound with iron and studded with cruel spikes along its rim. Torches blazed high, filling the hall with the smell of pitch. The high priest, robed in crimson, addressed Adrian in a booming voice. You have endured the fire, the thorns, and the cage, yet you refuse to bow. Tonight, you will break. And when you do, the world shall know that no spirit can resist our will. Adrian, bloodied and half-naked, lifted his head slowly. His long black hair hung matted over his face, but through the strands, his sharp eyes glimmered with contempt. Then you will fail once more, he rasped, his voice hoarse yet steady. The priests bound him to the wheel. His arms and legs were stretched unnaturally wide, wrists shackled, ankles locked against the iron. The wheel turned slowly, lifting him into the air. With each rotation, spikes dug deeper into his flesh, tearing open wounds until blood trickled down like rivers along. The wooden spokes. Every twist of the wheel pulled cries from him, but never surrender. His body shook violently, his jaw clenched so tightly blood seeped from his lips where he bit through the skin. The priests chanted louder, their words echoing in the cavernous hall. The wheel spun faster, spikes raking his skin, breaking him, open with every turn. Guards looked away, unable to bear the sight. Yet Adrian's voice rose above it all, hoarse but clear, defying them. You will never own me. The high priest grew furious. He motioned for torches to be brought close, pressing heat against the wheel until the wood itself began to scorch. The smell of burning timber mixed with blood, filling the chamber with choking fumes. The wheel groaned under the heat, each crack of timber echoing like thunder. Adrian felt the fire kiss his skin, agony shooting through every nerve. His vision blurred, black spots swimming before his eyes. In that haze, he saw again the faces of those who once mattered. His father's stern gaze, his mother's gentle smile, comrades long fallen. He realized then that his suffering was no longer just his own. It was a banner, a defiance that would outlive him. Summoning the last reserves of strength, Adrian threw his head back and screamed, not a scream of pain, but a roar of defiance that shook even the vaulted stone. The priests faltered in their chant. The high priest staggered, his face twisting with fear for the first time. The wheel shuddered violently, as if the very force of Adrian's spirit rattled its iron bindings. Flames licked higher, swallowing the wood. The chains groaned. In one final crack, the wheel split apart. Adrian fell to the ground, broken and bloodied, yet still alive. The chamber plunged into chaos. Guards rushed forward, but hesitated at the sight of him rising to his knees, his body a ruin of scars and blood, yet his eyes blazing like fire. He did not speak. He did not need to. His survival was victory enough. And so, though his body bore the ruin of endless torment, Adrian's will remained unbroken. The priests had failed. They had sought to create silence, and instead had forged a legend. That night, as torches sputtered and the hall reeked of smoke, whispers spread among the guards and slaves alike. He will not die. He cannot be broken. And so Adrian's story did not end in chains, but in defiance, a man who had endured every cruelty and remained unyielding. His name carried in hushed tones, a symbol that no cage, no crown, no wheel could conquer the human spirit.